I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your Wednesday afternoon to join us to talk about water and climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about social justice. So thank you for having me. And I want to say happy anniversary. 20 years is huge. And I'm so thankful that the American River Flood Control District um, now can be a part of the water forum. So thank you, Tom, and everyone for this invite. And yes, like Tom said, my name is Tamika. I'm a trustee on the American River Flood Control District. But before I dive into what we do, I just want to take a moment to set an intention for my presentation today, because I really want this to be a conversation between us, even though it's kind of a one-sided conversation right now. But I want to invoke some thoughts. These are some of the thoughts I ask myself, and when I sit to lead, I ask myself questions and my colleagues questions. And so I want to go through this exercise with you, because it's going to take all of us, not just to address climate change, but it's going to take all of us for flood control. So one thing is I want to leave you with a better understanding of the American River Flood Control District, what we do in my role as a board member. I also want to leave you with a better understanding of the environmental and social justice connections to flood control, because we don't often make those connections initially. And then I hope you will support just and progressive policies that protect all neighborhoods from flooding, but especially our vulnerable communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So first, a quick introduction. Can you go back to slide 2, please? Thank you. So I just wanted to share a little bit about me, since we are going to be having this conversation together. I was born and raised here in Sacramento. I was born on Mather Air Force Base in 1979. And my first experience with flooding was when I was a little girl. And Sacramento faced rainfall that challenged historical records. It was 1986, and I was in the first grade. And I remember leaving my babysitter's house, and my school, Arrow Haven, right there in North Highlands, was the end of the street. And we'd walk every day, but during this time, it was different. I didn't know what flooding was, but I had experienced it for the first time when I couldn't get to school. And it wasn't just a large puddle, but it was a significant impassable amount of water. And the memory stuck with me because it was my first experience with flooding, and it was seen through the eyes of a child. And not only that, I was a little girl who didn't know how to swim and feared large bodies of water. It was big, it was scary. And like I said, I didn't understand why it happened. Then fast forward into the 1990s, and we moved to South Natomas, beautiful floodplain of South Natomas, where even if Sacramento as a whole didn't experience regional flooding, we sure did on our streets. We would have to find alternative routes to school every season. I remember helping my friends, the Sieglitzes, over on Garden Highway, filling sandbags to keep water from rushing into their living room. Like growing up in Natomas, we were used to finding those alternate routes, figuring out where the sandbag locations were, and being on water watch. Now, I'm a parent of 2 children, and I wonder what lasting memories will they have of their childhood home, Sacramento? What role do I have in shaping those memories? When there is a major flood, because we know that there will be eventually, will my kids know what to do? Will my neighbors know what to do? How will I be able to protect them? Will there be a Sacramento for my children and your children to raise families of their own? So these are the questions that led me to serving on the American River Flood Control District. I bring with me my passion for community advocacy and my experience, not just as a teacher, as you probably could tell, but as a park ambassador, as a green space ambassador, as a resident, and as a parent who cares about the city and wants a Sacramento that is thriving and safe for all of our families for many generations. And so I began my service June of 2019. I was sworn in by Trustee Vanderwerf. I am one of 5 members serving on the American River Flood Control District. And my colleagues and I are diverse in our professions, which contribute to really thoughtful and considerate dialogue as a group. Our board members have experience and interests in green energy, water science, urban planning, engineering, and community organizing. We are a team of community leaders and individuals who care about keeping our city safe and well prepared for drastic weather patterns and flooding. And our management team at American River Flood Control District, Tim, our executive director, Ross, our superintendent, these folks are also people who care about keeping our city safe. And they're the backbone of our organization. They diligently work every single day to keep our homes and our families safe. They do the work and they maintain our system. Next slide. So what do you think about when you think of flood control? And it's probably something you really don't think about, and I get that. But I'm hoping to change that today. And most folks, yes, flood control is levees and rivers and sandbags. Those are very important, critical pieces to flood fight. But I want you to know that American River Flood Control District manages and maintains 40 miles of levee along the Sacramento River, including parts of Arcade Creek, Steelhead Creek, Magpie Creek, and Dry Creek. Our workers go out each and every day to mow, repair, and inspect our levee system. And that includes filling holes caused by human or animal. It means keeping tall grasses down, and not just for fire safety and to decrease fire risk, but it also helps us to be able to thoroughly inspect for any damage to our levee system. Each year, our GM participates in events to educate folks on the importance of water and flood prevention, such as the High Water Jamboree. This year, we were really excited to be able to join in the Earth Day celebration, but unfortunately, it was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we recognize that our work is directly impacted by the effects of climate change, which is why we are joining you here today, why we joined Sacramento Earth Day Festival for the first time this year. Because we have to do this together, we have to collaborate better, and we have to be using a dialogue that all of us can understand and can gain tools from. But it must recognize that science and data matter, and that weather events across our country are becoming more frequent and more extreme. We need to have a sense of urgency. Next slide. So let's talk about some 21st century flood control conversations. What are we talking about today? Well, yes, we still talk about sandbags and levees and river water. But there are some other conversations you might not know are happening at the maintenance and at the board level. We can feel the effects of climate change right here in our communities. To be well prepared, we often look at other policies and other leaders that came before us. But there are some issues like Tony had mentioned earlier, you know, that leadership back then didn't have environmentalism and social justice and climate justice at the top of their mind. And that's why we need to now, right? So some of the issues with previous policies may not have been adequately addressed, and they're contributing to the issues that we are facing today. Some of those are riverbank and creek erosion, right? Reservoir levels, snowpack melt, accumulation, runoff, and extreme weather cycles. Looking at the historic rainfall in Sacramento in particular, not looking at snowpack, because snowpack plus rainfall means that we're working 24/7, right? But let's just take a minute to look at rainfall. Looking at the historical rainfall in the Sacramento region, our average rainfall is about 19 inches. Record-breaking seasons occurred in 1982 and 1982 to 1983 with 36.57 inches, and then 1889 to 1890 with 34.6 inches, and then in 2016, 2017 with 34 inches. Now it seems like those are kind of all over the place, but really the rainfall from 1889 to 1890, that was over 100 years ago. We have been facing extreme droughts and extreme rainfalls in our communities over these past few years that are just happening with a lot more frequency. The two highest records, 1982 and 2016, with the third being 1986. Those are all within my lifetime. That's why we need a sense of urgency. That's why we need to start now. A combination, like I said, of rainfall and heavy and snow melt from a healthy snowpack, if we're lucky, can mean disaster for communities that are downstream. And we know that even though those records weren't broken in consecutive years, our infrastructure must be ready to handle the impacts of extreme weather happening more frequently. It puts pressure on the entire system, so it requires systems thinking. I think next slide. And I'm just going to take a quick second to grab a sip of water. So other 21st century conversations that we are having, they must include environmental justice. We must always use an environmental justice lens in our policy decisions. We look at direct human influence on threats to levee maintenance and our waterways. And some of these issues include invasive plants and species that threaten the biodiversity of our natural habitats along the American River. Some of these were intended, all well intended, to stay contained within people's yards and homes, but over the years we've seen it overgrow onto our levee system and compromise the native plants that we work to preserve. Easements and encroachments. The American River is a lovely place to be able to purchase a home if you have that ability. But we also have to remember that the levees and the trails belong to all of the community, everybody who's recreating or passing by, trying to get from one part of Sacramento to the other. And we want to be sure we are providing a safe environment. When neighbors build onto the tops of the levees or into the sides of the levees, a practice that really hasn't been allowed in the past 20 years, well, that has long-term effects, and that can be detrimental to the entire community. Not only does it create a challenge for us when we need to inspect and repair, but the engineering practices, the thought process that people went through back then did not consider the environmental challenges we are facing today. Encroachments onto the levees have potential to negatively impact erosion and our ability to control water. And then mitigation practices. To best be prepared for environmental disaster, we aim to reduce the physical and the financial impacts that communities face through outreach and education. But again, these conversations must extend beyond traditional flood boardrooms and flood control measures. They must include environmental impacts. We must include social impacts. We must include climate impacts in our decisions. Otherwise, we're just going to repeat history and we're going to repeat the losses as weather cycles again become more extreme. This is an important piece for the preservation of our city and our people. So I've talked a lot about social justice because I cannot talk about flood control without discussing the impacts our policies have on societal systems. Next slide, please. So flood control is a social justice issue. And if I were to separate it, it would be extremely irresponsible of me. Flood control is about protecting people and their safety nets. It includes residences, schools, hospitals, grocery stores, etc. Societal issues such as homelessness and community engagement are flood control issues. Our levees are in place to keep everyone in Sacramento safe, including our houseless community. In recent years, we've felt the increase of people experiencing homelessness on our levees and our creeks and our rivers. And since joining the board, we have worked to keep track of the resources that are used to clean up camps in order to repair and maintain levees. But I will tell you this, we are not in the practice of moving people. We are here to serve Sacramento. And we're here to do it in a compassionate, just, and smart way. We have to be able to see people beyond their individual circumstances. So let's talk about social justice and flood control. Merely adapting to the increase of homelessness is not a sustainable practice. As a flood control representative, I believe it is important for us to be housing advocates as well. I've refrained from focusing on the discussion of property intentionally today, because for our most vulnerable community members, they do not have a particular piece of property that they own. I grew up with a single mom who rented. I didn't own anything in my life. I did not own a piece of land until I became 30-something years old. And that was a privilege that my mom still hasn't been able to afford. She's still a renter living in the Woodlake area, living in our levee district. My job as a flood control advocate is also a housing advocate and a shelter advocate. You see, it doesn't help to just move people without making their situation better. Renters, young people, our houseless population, they feel the environmental impacts of climate change and extreme weather more than we do. And it's harder for them to recover more than we do. But the environmental impacts of large unhoused communities, that does have a direct effect on our levee system and our infrastructure and our water quality. Even if people's solution to move people from the levees was practical and realistic and just, which it is not. But even if it were, without proper sanitation services and human waste removal services, the runoff would end up into the drains that lead to the waters anyway. Just moving people from one part of the city to another doesn't solve all of our issues. It doesn't solve the root problem. We're not looking at solutions with a systems thinking lens. We are just trying to manage. And I think we should be done with that. We need to move forward. Community building. At American River Flood Control District, we want to be good neighbors, and we want you to be good neighbors to each other. We recognize the diversity of the communities we serve. We also recognize that representation matters. Flood control is a job for everyone, and not all of the same communities have the same privileges and resources. And so we have to also look at flood control as an equity issue, one that we cannot afford to ignore. When we look at equity and flood control, let's ask ourselves a few questions, right? Because remember I said I wanted us to go through some thought exercises. Are resources allocated equitably across the district? Do we have emergency preparation and education resources for low-income community members or houseless community members who might not have access to a television or a cell phone, or a person to say, hey, find some higher land, water is coming? Do we have that in place? How are diverse communities with varying needs represented? Are all stakeholders part of the decision making? Are there language or mobility barriers to expanding into our communities and advocating flood control in our communities? Are there some language barriers that we have not addressed or been sensitive to? And then when we are advocating for more bike lanes, or for more bike trails and jogging trails, I want to make sure that we're advocating that for everybody. I live a block from a levee, and my levee has a lot different feel than the levees of some more affluent areas. I want to be sure that when you are advocating for levees and for clean rivers, that you're advocating that for all communities, not just the ones that can afford it. So these are just a few of the questions I ask myself as a flood board rep. And this is how we will address flood control and safety and environmental justice. We have to link it all together. We can't talk about one without talking about the others. I mean, this year's our neighbors in the Gulf, the Midwest, the southern border states, they've faced numerous hurricanes and weather-related disasters. And some communities in recent years still haven't recovered, but they keep getting hit year after year after year. I don't want that for Sacramento. So what are we going to do about it? Where are we headed? Next slide. So I'm not going to pretend that I know all the answers, because I don't. But as we move forward, we stand to benefit from looking at flood control with a systemic and sustainable lens. If the decision makers of 50 years ago were having these conversations today, how would Sacramento be different? What kind of Sacramento do we want in 50 years? To figure that out, thank you, we need a regional plan, a study to identify the critical infrastructure risks to climate change. We need to address the vulnerabilities, and we need to create policies to address infrastructure and social and environmental justice. We need to work with our community members, our state agencies, and our elected officials across jurisdictions. We need to educate our homeowners and property owners. We need to create an outreach system for our unhoused and low income and immigrant communities. We must consider biodiversity for long-term sustainability. We have to think of flood control with intergenerational equity, not just thinking about having a 5 or 10 or 20-year plan. We must take a 7th generation approach to decision making by asking ourselves, how do my decisions today affect 7 generations of the world into the future? Pollution reduction is a man-made construct. It is up to us to decrease and identify where we contribute to the emission levels, not just at American River Flood Control District, but us as individuals. And we must protect and preserve our communities, all of our communities. sorry, just got my warning. I'm wrapping up. So this is my ask of you. This is how you can help. Individuals, make an emergency plan, attend our flood control meetings. They are the second Friday of every month, except for this month, it'll be this Friday. But during flood season, our crews are on 24/7, and you can call us at 916-929-4006. We also have our state and federal flood control center at 1-800-952-5530. Urge your leaders and your policymakers to take flood control seriously, to be more involved, to get more connected with us, and to collaborate more with us so we can create solutions that aren't just for the few, but for all of Sacramento. We need to take a systems lens approach. I know I went over my time a bit, but I just want to thank you so much for engaging with me in these questions and these conversations that I have with myself and colleagues, but I want you to have these conversations amongst your network, amongst your neighbors, friends. Make sure your parents, I need to make sure my mom has a flood control plan. Make sure your families are taken care of. And please be safe. Thank you.
Tamika, thank you so much for the conversation. You started by saying I'm having a conversation, and you ended by asking us to have a conversation with the people in our lives, and it's very much appreciated. And we are a little over time, but do you have time to do one question?
Yes. Yeah, and I'll be back later for Q&A.
That's right. You'll be on the panel. Lily or Kat, you want to throw one question at us? Lily or Grace, excuse me.
Yeah. Hi, Tamika. Thank you so much. We have one question from Ann Cole, and I'm going to read it, and it was in the chat for those of you who'd like to follow along. How will climate change affect local flooding now that we have both with stormwater runoff in wet years and when pumps are turned off at the American River and we have backflow, flues in Arden Arcade, one area?
Well, I think that I don't have the answer to that, because I think, again, what we need to do is a very, very thorough multi-district study about the snowpack and the water. The question disappeared. Oh no. We need to do like a thorough study though about an updated study about for our little pocket, how we can be better environmentalists when it comes to water flow, how much we let go, how much we are pumping. I don't have enough information at this time, but I also don't think we have coordinated well as a region and as a community to really identify that in a practical, realistic way. That's not just sunshine and rainbows.
Very good. Can I ask everyone to give a virtual round of applause for Tamika? Thanks so much, Tamika.